Hello and welcome to part 3 of Writers Essentials 12-part novel writing programme. My name is Sarah Hull and I'm the Creative Director for Writers Essentials. This third session is called Crafting the World for Your Story. This session is all about the world inside your novel and how you can use it to draw your reader in, immerse them in the world inside your novel and keep them reading. So first of all, you need to decide where and when your story is set. Starting with, is it set in the real world, an alternative version of the real world, or a fantasy world? Now, what do I mean by that? By the real world, I mean that the world inside your novel is recognisable as the world we live in, and the story inside the novel, the story you're telling, could happen or could have happened in the real world. So crime thrillers come under this bracket. Most romantic comedy fits into this as well, and quite a lot of historical fiction. The other one, or the next one rather, is the fantastical world. This is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is where your world inside your story is completely made up, completely invented. It bears little or no resemblance to the real world. Examples of this would be Narnia and Middle-earth. The last one is the alternative version of the real world, and this is a bit trickier. This is where the story inside your novel is recognisable as the real world. It has similarities, it has common things in it that we would recognise, but with key differences, and it would normally be one or more of these three differences. One, it'll be the real world but with an alternative history, or the real world with a projected future, so it'll be set in the real world but in the future, so it's a made-up reality. In that way it's a projected version of our world as it is now. Or it's the real world but where things are physically possible which aren't physically possible in reality, so fantastical things can happen. And examples of this would be dystopian fiction like George Orwell's 1984, Orcs and Crake by Margaret Atwood, or stories like the Harry Potter stories or the Twilight stories. You then need to decide more specifically what area, region, country in that world is your story set. And then you need to go down to another level of detail and you need to decide what part of that country, what town, what city, what village, what street, what house, what building, or which buildings, which rooms even, your story is set. And then when, what year is it, and even what time of year, even what date if possible does your story start. And as soon as you start to make these decisions, it will put limitations on your story. This is because as soon as the reader knows anything about the setting in your story, they will start to build up a picture in their mind. Your job as the writer is to build up that picture in the mind of the reader in such a way that draws them into the world in your story and keeps them reading. It means, and in order to do that, you need to know as much as you can, as much detail as you can about the world in which your story is set. And every detail that you add, every detail you include or you reference has to be consistent and believable. As I've said before, anything that is part of the story, whether it's in the plot or with the characters or in the setting, that jars as being inconsistent and unbelievable for the reader will break their immersion in the story and will lessen their enjoyment in reading it. The next thing to do is research. Now, as fiction writers, we can make up every detail of our setting if that's what we'd like to do. Right from the really big things like the name of the country, down to small things like the type of food the characters have in their fridge, or whatever device is used to keep things cool in this world. But if the reader doesn't believe in the setting inside the story, they're a lot less likely to believe in the story itself. So it's better to have a mixture of some details being made up and some details being made based on research. And how much of your story, how much of your setting for your story is based on research and how much of it is made up will depend on how much is actually known about a time and or place. This is because the more a reader knows about a real time and a real place, the more likely it is that something that is invented, something that is added, an added detail or a made up detail will jar as being unrealistic or inconsistent, and again that will break the reader's immersion in the story. So if you're writing about a real time and a real place, you will need to do a lot of research, base your setting on fact, and make sure that anything that is added, any fact or detail for the story or the setting or whatever it might be that is invented and added is consistent with those facts. So I would avoid, for instance, having miniskirts in Elizabethan England. Somebody will notice. If you're dealing with a made-up time and a real place, or vice versa, you will still need to do a lot of research, but you will also need to add more, invent more. And again, any details you add, any details you make up, will need to be consistent with what is known. It'll need to be consistent with the facts. So for example, if you base a story in Britain, a real place, but in 2070, a made-up time because it's a time we haven't yet experienced, you will need to research what Britain is like now, and perhaps more importantly, what are the projections for Britain's future in order to predict a realistic version of Britain in 55 years or so. And then, if you're writing about a completely made-up time and place, a fantasy reality, a fantasy world, you will still need to do some research, but you will also need to do a lot of very careful thinking. Just because your time and place are made up, everything in that time and place, in that setting, still needs to fit together, still needs to be realistic and consistent within the framework of your story. So I would avoid having swords and microwaves, or having a very, very hot temperatures on a planet and everybody walking around in fur coats. And finally, you need to decide the rules of your setting, of your world. Again, even if it is a fantasy world or an alternative world where fantastical things are possible, there will still be limitations on what can and cannot happen and what your characters can and cannot do. This is about what is physically possible, the laws, the rules of your world and your setting. So for example, if it's established in your story that everyone can fly, but people have to open a door to get from one room to another, and then suddenly a character walks through a wall, the rules of your world have been broken because it's been established earlier on that people can't do that, your characters can't do that. And if there isn't a very good explanation as to why suddenly these characters can do that, can walk through walls, again, it'll jar as being unrealistic and inconsistent, and it will break the reader's immersion in your story. So when you've decided where and when your story is set, and how much of your setting is based on research and how much is going to be invented, you can start adding details to your setting. And to do this, it can help to ask yourself questions. So you can start with really big things like, what is the history of the place, the region, the area, this country, even the world? What is the landscape like? And what is the climate like? And then who is the ruling body? Is there some sort of social hierarchy or something similar? How does the legal system work? And then ask yourself, what's the local language or languages? Are there several dialects? Then go down to a deeper level of detail and ask yourself, what jobs do people do? What hobbies do they have? What kind of homes do they live in, or what kind of other buildings are there in towns and cities? And what do people eat and drink and wear and listen to and read? And then go down to another level of detail and ask things like, how do people greet each other? And how do they greet each other in the morning, in the evening? How do they greet someone who they know really well? How do they greet maybe a child or an older person? How do they greet someone who's a higher or lower social class than themselves? What does the furniture look like in their homes? How do they decorate their homes? And then things like, what kind of toys do the children play with? Or even what kind of toys do adults play with? And every detail you add, every part of the setting that you develop, adds to the picture in the reader's mind, and this will help immerse the reader in the setting in your story, and in the story itself. So having developed your setting with this level of detail, you will end up with a lot of information. And one, this will be quite difficult to remember, but also you're going to need to keep referring back to this information as you add to it, because you won't be able to develop all these details before you start writing your novel. So I recommend you create things that you can refer back to in order to develop the setting, and also in order to make it consistent, realistic, believable. So you can just use written notes, but you could also try things like timelines, town or building or area maps. You could try drawing out a family tree if you have a complicated system of families in your story. You could try doing drawings if you're good at drawing. Draw out a scene, draw out a room that's used quite a lot in your story, that's key to your story, or maybe a marketplace or a beach or a law court. You could try using maps, creating maps for your setting, again to help you remember maybe where everything is. Or even, if you feel like it, try using Lego models Do a Lego model of the town where your story is set if that will help you remember. Now you can start to imagine what it's like to inhabit the world inside your story. Try immersing yourself inside the setting, inside the world that you've created, and think about what atmosphere it has. Think about the wider context of the setting. Think about political changes that are going on, maybe changes in leadership or leadership battles, or even things like important sport matches which might affect how people are thinking and feeling. Think about what it feels like to be there. Think about what you can smell and see and hear and even taste and touch as the characters move around the setting you've created. And also think about how all these details, all the details you've worked out, from the really big things like the history of the place, right down to the shoes on people's feet, how do these things affect the characters, the kind of people who exist in this world, and how do these details influence the events of your story? Because the events and the characters need to come from the setting, they need to be placed there, they need to naturally evolve from there, as well as affecting the place in which they're set. And finally, when you start using setting in your writing, in your novel, there's two things to be wary of. Firstly, having an underdeveloped setting. If your setting is underdeveloped, i.e. not enough time has been spent developing the setting, developing the world in which your story is set, or lots of time has been spent on that, developing those details, but it hasn't transferred to the page, it can end up feeling like the story and the characters are existing in a void, they're kind of floating in space. This makes it much harder for the reader to visualise the story, to visualise what's going on, and it makes it a lot less interesting to read. The second thing to be wary of is including everything. Once you've developed your setting, developed all these details, once you know everything about the world inside your story, the history, the landscape, the culture, even exactly what it feels like to walk around that world, it can be incredibly tempting just to include everything, every single detail. The problem with that is it can then make a novel read like a travel book or a history book. Only include what is relevant when it is relevant to the story. In this way, you can create the world inside your story to be almost real for your reader, and it will then help to immerse your reader in your story and will encourage them to keep reading. In next month's session 4 of our creative writing programme, I'm going to be looking at character and how you develop characters from being just a vague outline to real breathing characters that come off the page. If you're around in the area, join us for the live class on Tuesday the 4th of August at 6 p.m. in the White Horse Bar on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, or catch up with the online version on our website or on YouTube from Wednesday the 5th of August. See you then.